Hi, I'm Peggy Devian. I'm the curator of the Ottawa County Museum, which is at 126 West 3rd Street. I know there's at least one person here who probably doesn't know where it is, and it's right across the street. It's a low-grade building. So we're open in the summer from 12 to 3, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Or you can call me at home, and the number's on the door, or I'll give it to you if you want it. If you want to book a time outside of that, I'm happy to do that, as long as we can find a time we can both come, and we usually can. We'd just like to encourage you to come. And I'm not doing much of an introduction because we've read a lot about this lighthouse in the paper, but I would like to say there's a donation jar. I'm not too proud anymore, and Rich says he's used to asking for money. So the money that you give us, usually we keep it for the museum, but today we're going to go halvesies on it. It'll be half for the museum and half for the lighthouse. And we both survive by donations. So please think of us whenever you hear somebody from one of these asking for money. Think of how we need it. And so this is Rich Norgard. He's retired from the Army. I'm retired from the Navy, but we still get it on. So he's done a lot for this community since he's been here the last few years. And the first time I met him, do you remember when that was? He probably doesn't remember.
Yes, I do. Now, why don't you tell us?
He walked in the museum one night on New Year's Eve, right? You remember that? No, you don't remember that.
Keep going.
We were open once on New Year's Eve, and he was the only customer we had the whole evening. So he came in, and that's how I met him. But I knew his father. I didn't know his mom, but I knew his dad. And he's a Port Clinton fellow, so he's really dedicated to making things better in Port Clinton. So, Rich?
Thank you, Peggy. Wow, what an introduction. It always amazes me that the front seat rows are empty. And boy, it would be a really neat trick if I could just take these and move them to the back and be beautiful. But I'm not going to do that. Anyway, as Peggy said, I'm Richard Norgard. I'm the president of the Port Clinton Lighthouse Conservancy. You probably have all heard about the restoration effort. This talk is going to focus on the history of the lighthouse, but I am going to go beyond 1952 if we have time. If you want to stick around, I'll go as long as you want. But I have also a number of photos about dealing with the restoration, and I'm happy to talk about that and answer any questions you have. At any point in time, I want to keep this informal. At any point in time, if you have any questions, please jump in. I'll probably be calling on Chuck Reinstaff with the museum, whose research and assistance on this has been invaluable. I couldn't have put this all together without Chuck, so I want to thank him up front. So first, to clear up any confusion, why do I call this a history of the Port Clinton Light Station and not lighthouse? Okay, so the lighthouse is itself the structure that we all know, with typically a tower with a light on top. The light station is the term that the lighthouse establishment, which is the organization that the government created to manage all the lighthouses in the United States, they called it a light station, which includes the tower and all of the accompanying structures that go with the lighthouse. So there's more to a lighthouse operation than just the lighthouse. There's the dwelling for lighthouse keeper in some cases, and in the case of this lighthouse, there was a boathouse, there was an oil house, and I'll talk a little bit about what those structures were. But all of that put together, whether they're attached and close together or spread apart, which is the case in our lighthouse, it's all together considered the light station. So that's why we talk about the light station. So Port Clinton, you're probably not going to be able to read that very well, but so Port Clinton, of course, is a port town. The town itself was founded in 1928, and if I get any dates wrong, Chuck, you're going to correct me, I know. but a fellow from Cincinnati named Ezekiel Haynes laid out the town, and he was very specific about the things that he anticipated would be in the town, and one of those was a lighthouse. So even before there was a lighthouse, Ezekiel Haynes made room for a lighthouse in town. Lighthouses themselves are almost as old as sea travel itself. So when people started to venture out onto the water and were piloting boats and going through the sea, they recognized that there were obstructions out there. There were reefs, there were rocks. The weather was always changing, so you would get out there and you didn't always know where you were at any given time. Because if you've ever been out in the water or on a boat, you know that it looks a lot different from out there looking back in than it does looking out. And so knowing where you are, knowing where the hazards are, is essential to safe sea travel. And that's true of whether you're on the Atlantic Ocean or whether you're in the Great Lakes. And when they started to explore the Great Lakes, really in earnest, when white folks started to explore the Great Lakes in the late 1700s, early 1800s, they recognized the need for lighthouses. So a little bit about types of lighthouses. And again, the lighthouse establishment that I talked about, they basically classified lighthouses in terms of the importance of the place that they were located in terms of the sea travel. So the biggest lighthouses have been reserved for the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. And so they're sort of right up there. And so those lighthouses got the bigger lights that were displayed farther out. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about Fresnel lenses. There was a Frenchman in the early 1800s named Augustine Fresnel who invented a brilliant way to magnify light, because at that time really we didn't really know how to do that. You'd hang a lantern on a pole, and that were literally the first lighthouses were like a lantern hanging on a pole, and that's what they were. So after a while, people recognized that's not going to be adequate enough. We need to figure out a way to amplify light so that it can be seen farther out over the water. And so different things were tried, but until Mr. Fresnel came up with a Fresnel lens in the 1820s, it was a pretty poor effort up until that time. And you're going to see that the United States is very slow to adopt the Fresnel lens. They didn't adopt them until the 1850s, even though the United States knew about them. And there was a fellow that was running the lighthouse establishment called Pleasanton, who ran it for decades, and they finally kicked him out because he was sort of rooted in these old ways, and he would not adopt this new system. So it wasn't until the 1850s that they established a lighthouse board, because basically the system up to that time was corrupt and so forth. And so they established a lighthouse board made up of military people and engineers. And once they did that, they said to themselves, we have to adopt this Fresnel lens. And so getting back to my original point about the types of lighthouses, the biggest lens that there is would be the first order lens. So the first order lens are like 7 or 8 feet tall. And then second order would be a little smaller, third order, smaller still, maybe about 6 feet tall. The third order is the biggest lens that you'll find on the Great Lakes. Toledo Harbor had a third order, Marblehead Lighthouse had a third order. So those kinds of lenses and those sort of category of lighthouses, which would be the biggest ones you'll find on the Great Lakes, are the ones that sit typically on a high promontory at a point that ships going by need to sort of know where they are to navigate. So like Marblehead, the Marblehead Peninsula juts out And that's sort of a place you don't want ships running into, and you also want ships that are going by to be able to navigate on that point. So those lights need to be able to throw light out a great distance. And so they have those third order lenses. On down in the list of priority would be harbor lights, pier head lights, breakwater lights, range lights. So we're going to talk about our lighthouse being a pier head light, at least the second light. And we'll get to that. So anyway, so very early on, Port Clinton was a city. There's only a few hundred people here, but they were fishing. There was a thriving business in timber that was starting up in the early 1800s in this area. They were starting to harvest timber out of Oak Harbor, and boats were going back and forth, and they were coming out of the harbor, and they recognized early on the need for a lighthouse. And so that recommendation was made, and and what this is and it's signed by Mr. Pleasanton, who's the fellow that kind of screwed up the lighthouse establishment, and they replaced him. But so he basically signs here the approval for Levi Johnson to get the contract to build the first Port Clinton Lighthouse. And who was Levi Johnson? So actually, he was a pretty interesting character. He built a number of lighthouses. He built the first frame structure in Cleveland. He built the first stone structure, which stood until 1909. And so he was quite a guy. Built Cedar Point Lighthouse, built a lighthouse in Saginaw, Michigan. And so he's the guy that they contracted with.
Did you get the sound working?
Sound? No. We don't have a microphone. I don't think we need a microphone. Can everybody hear me?
No, you were asking about sound on the screen.
Oh, no, I don't need any.
Oh, okay.
No. Thank you. So anyway, in 1832, they contracted with Levi Johnson to build the first lighthouse, which was a stone structure 40 feet high. And they advertised in the newspaper also, in a number of area newspapers for the, advertising the specifications that they needed for this lighthouse, and they're very detailed. It goes into all the dimensions, and I won't go into all that, but it was a 40-foot high stone structure. And does anybody, I don't have an actual prize to hand out, but who can tell me where they built this lighthouse?
At the end of Madison.
Jefferson and Perry Street.
Perry Street by Adams Street.
Adams and Perry. What was then called East Market Street. So, so they built the stone structure, and Levi Johnson also built the keeper's dwelling next to it. So this is what it looked like. So we actually don't have any photographs of the lighthouse when it actually had a light on it. All the photographs we had are post 1870, which is when they discontinued the light. Now let me show you, I think the next one is, all right, so in this photograph, can we shut these lights on? It might make it just a little clearer. So, the way the Portage River used to look, and probably a number of you have already seen Chuck's presentation on the Portage River and how it's changed over the years, but just a little refresher. This is an engineer drawing from 1870, before they built the piers, showing how the Portage River came out along here and ran out along the shore and sort of meandered along. And you can imagine, if you understand how the lake works, and the sandbar situation and all that, the water coming in, they could dig it out, but you know there'd be a storm, and then 2 days later it's all filled in again, and so they could keep it you know, if they were lucky, they could keep it dredged out to a depth of 5, 6, 7, 8 feet. But it presented a continuing problem for navigation because they couldn't keep that open. Well, in any event, they built the lighthouse here because it was at the mouth of the river. And I don't understand why they didn't build it on the west side of the river. We do have drawings that show a lighthouse on that other side, but they never built one there. So that's always been a little confusing to me, is why they didn't build the lighthouse on. Chuck, do you have any thoughts on why?
No, I've always wondered, I think Haynes's initial plat of the town showed
Showed it on that other side.
Proposed lighthouse.
Yeah. So in any event, the actions of Lake Erie and the peculiar way that the Portage River ran created a continuing problem for navigation. They put the light there and then almost immediately began to question the need for a light in Port Clinton. And the research that we've done indicates this constant questioning by the government for a need for a lighthouse in Port Clinton, but always countered by the locals to say, no, we need a lighthouse here because, you know, we have traffic, it's a danger to people, and the government saying, well, you know, you don't really have enough tonnage, because for them, for the government's point of view, it's sort of a cost-benefit ratio. Okay, so how much commercial traffic is there to justify a lighthouse? And from the local standpoint, they're thinking, well, you know, there may be not that much tonnage, but we have fishermen going out there, sometimes they get back at night, they can't see the harbor, you know, it's a real problem. So there was a lot of this push-pull going on through the years. So this gives a pretty good description of what was there at the time they discontinued in 1970. Now, it's talking about these series of lamps and reflectors. So what the old lighthouses looked like was, I talked about before the Fresnel ends, what they basically do is, in these lighthouses, is at the top of the tower, and let's go look at the picture. So imagine that cap is not on the top of the tower. So imagine sort of a platform on top, and then in a circular around that would be a series of lamps, and then they would have these reflectors behind the lamps, basically reflecting the light out. So if you remember, like the old mantle lanterns where there was a reflector behind the light, that's literally what they used. Seems very primitive today, but that's how they magnified the light in those lighthouses. They counted on the height more than the intensity of the light to have that light, you know, seen for a fair amount of distance. And I haven't seen any figures on how far this light could be seen, but so anyway, you see this report then from the lighthouse establishment recommending that it be discontinued. They said it would not be to the slightest detriment to commerce to the lake if they got rid of it. And as I mentioned, the locals didn't see it that way. They really thought that we needed a lighthouse here, and they continued to fight for it. So again, before the river changed, so this would be, I believe, looking out from that point on the west side of the river, looking back toward shore. This is what the shoreline looked like. And so from the river flowed from right to left, and of course to the right you see the lighthouse and the keeper's house.
Rich,
Yeah.
that last photo is at least 1882 or later, because the front portion of the Lake Hotel was built in 1882. It's got 1870 on it, so I make note.
Okay, okay. And this is an interesting picture because you can see the sand. And of course, Old Perry Street was farther south than it is now. And here you can see literally the beach right there in front of the keeper's door. This is pretty much looking from straight out. Again, there's the lakeshore / riverfront. And I think, and we've speculated about this one, but I think that in this picture you can see staking along the riverbed, where they're sort of trying to keep the channel open through there. Chuck, you have any comments on this one?
Well, they had two things. They used what we call spar buoys, which are small little things. You see the netting there. I know they also used a thing called a catch sand fence. And I don't know if, because of that net, I don't quite know what a catch sand fence is, but I don't know if that netting that you see on it might be to reduce, get sand from moving into there.
Maybe the same principle as the fencing you see on the beach.
Right.
To keep the sand from blowing, maybe they think that'll keep it out of the channel. Okay, so, all right, so they discontinued the light in 1870, discontinued it for good. They continued to pay somebody $1 a day to basically maintain the dwelling. They actually had offers to purchase the property, but the government said, well, we might need it for something in the future, which it turns out they did, and they didn't sell it, but and there were people living in there. Now, one other thing worth mentioning is that, little old Port Clinton, not that much ever happened in terms of the Lighthouse Keeper. They had to, they had very specific duties. They had to keep the lenses clean, the lanterns clean. They had to, of course, light the light and extinguish the light on a daily basis. And they had to keep all that stuff clean. They were subject to frequent inspections, and if they were drunk on duty or anything like that, they could be fired. But one thing notable that we do know happened in 1836, there was a ship that was headed from Buffalo to Chicago with some immigrants, and I believe that it was a two-masted schooner, but we don't have a lot of documentation on the ship itself. But there was some members of the McRitchie family and the Lattimore family were headed to Chicago, and instead the ship grounded off Port Clinton in the gale, was literally blown ashore, and they had to be rescued by the local town folks, one of whom was the first lighthouse keeper, Austin Smith, who was, they say, a sea captain from Connecticut. He was the first lighthouse keeper. So Austin Smith helped rescue these folks, and of course, some of the descendants of these folks are now notable people in the local community. But they were rescued. A couple of the folks, we believe, were taken ashore and given shelter in the keeper's house until they got back on their feet, and then they stayed in the community. So that was an interesting event. So, so what happened in the meantime, and I should go back to my shot for the river. So in 1868, they first, I think that was the earliest date, right? They first got the idea that they need to change the direction of the river. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to keep it dredged and deep enough for traffic. So, so it was first proposed in '68, but it wasn't until the 1870s that money was obtained, funding was obtained to begin to reroute the river. They first built up here, I think on the west pier was first. They built the west pier first. They continued to dredge. After a couple of years, that still was not adequate enough to keep all the sanding and stuff and the fill-in from keeping the river open. So they built, then they built an east pier, and all that was completed by late 1880?
1881.
81. So by 81, and keep in mind, the first lighthouse is now decommissioned. By 81, they have the 2 piers going out there, and now they're able to dredge the river fully. Larger boats can come in. I believe they keep it to at least 9 feet, 8 and 9 feet in depth. Boats could go in and out. And now the locals are starting to petition the government again that they need a lighthouse. The government took a look at that and said, well, you got a lighthouse there, but it's totally inadequate now for what you want, because number one, it's in the wrong place. What you need is a pier head light. So in about 1893, they first, the Congress allocated money to build a second lighthouse. However, the money, although it was authorized, the actual construction was not finally authorized until 1896. And so here's the approval. And we've been fortunate. We've had a researcher do research at the National Archives, and we sort of had, among our group, we sort of had this running bet about, was this lighthouse built at a lighthouse depot, or was it built by local labor? And this may answer the question. It says built by hired labor. And then we have some other documentation that says that at least some of the timber for the project came from the Port Clinton Lumber Company. It doesn't actually say the Port Clinton Lumber Company built it, so it's still a little bit sketchy. But the theory would be that the Port Clinton Lumber Company was contracted to build the lighthouse to the specifications of the lighthouse establishment. Now, it would be good to mention at this point that, and I had mentioned that in 1852, they set up a lighthouse board, which made this whole system much more regimented. It was headed up by an Army general, and they hired basically military officers and engineers to run the thing. And the other thing they did is they divided up the country into lighthouse districts. So Lighthouse District 10 basically encompassed Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And the headquarters for that was in Buffalo. And so each district had its own depot. So there was a lighthouse district in Buffalo, and at that depot, that's where they basically maintained the supplies that went out to all the light stations within that district. So like if you needed like an oil can or a funnel or a broom, we'd fill out a requisition and it would go to Buffalo and it would come from that depot. But they did more than that. They also repaired the lights, repaired the lenses. If you broke something, you would send it up to the depot, they would fix it. And sometimes they even built like little lighthouses. And we know this because there's records that show that some of these little lighthouses, and back in the 1800s, in particular on the Great Lakes, there were a lot of these little river fronts, breakwaters, piers, had small wooden lighthouses. The beautiful thing about our lighthouse is that almost all those wooden lighthouses are gone, except ours. There's only very few that still exist. Canada still has some, but for the most part, they either burned, and if they didn't already burn or just deteriorate, they were eventually replaced by a steel tower. But ours stayed around until 1952, and it was because of that, and because of the diligence of people after that, it was saved. So that's a very special thing about our lighthouse. So in any event, here they approved the building of it. And of course, once you put a lighthouse out there, you got to let everybody know that there's now a light there. And this is the original notice to mariners of 1896, saying that there's going to be a light put out there as of July 15th. That was the day that the second Port Clinton Lighthouse was first lit. And by the way, that was 120 years ago, as of yesterday. Okay, so the old, so they had torn down the old tower in 1899, and thanks to Chuck's research, it was determined, it's been learned that they took the stone. The government likes to find repurposed stuff, so they took the stone from when they tore down the old tower, and they took it to the Grassy Island light station, and apparently used it to build up the bank along there, Chuck, basically.
From what I get. It said bulkhead.
Right. So now we have a new lighthouse here, and with a lighthouse keeper who's on a salary, and the government needs to provide him a place to live. So they took a look at the old keeper's house, and as you can see here, they find that it's totally inadequate. And of course, it took them 4 years to realize that, which I think is kind of amusing. So whether the first keeper was actually living in that thing, or whether he was, living at home, I don't know. But so they finally realized, this thing's not adequate. We got to build a new one. So here is a letter in which they basically had a bidder, and they allowed a bid to go to this new, Mr. Edward Birch of Port Clinton. Does anybody know any Birches? I don't know. I haven't seen that name around here. But this is who got the contract to build a new keeper's house. And one of the funny things about, you think people, you take for granted today, everybody's got a camera in their phone and everybody's taking pictures, but there are very few pictures of the second keeper's house when it was actually a keeper's house. And Chuck's found a few, and here's actually, this was a picture of something else, and the keeper's house happened to be in it, but there's part of it, the original keeper's house. So they tore down this old stone, one-story building, and they built a two-story wooden structure, and I think it had 6 bedrooms.
Probably. I forget how many.
And so it was a nice little house, and up until a few years ago, it was still there.
Where is it?
I'm gonna get to what happened to it.
Oh, we wanted to know where it was.
Oh, where it was? Oh, I'm sorry. So they tore down the old one, and they put up the new one in the same place. So Adams and Perry. And to jump ahead, to spoil the surprise a little bit, there's a bank branch there.
Rich, was at one time a coffee shop in that building?
Yes,
Yes.
yeah. And I'll get into that too, but it became different
Because I thought my
things.
mother went there.
Yeah, it was different. Ownership changed over time. But, okay, so in 1906, the engineer comes here and does an assessment of the light station, and he basically does this nice little plan up showing everything that's sort of there. So, so here's the pier going out. Here's the lighthouse, and the lighthouse was originally built. Of course, all the pictures you see now, and then we were restoring it. It's up on piers, but it originally was built on piles. So it was built on what we believe was a wooden, hardwood, oak pile foundation. And there's the dimensions of it. Here are the dimensions for the new keeper's house, which was erected in 1902. He has the location, he has everything included here. And there's the boathouse. Now, so the boathouse was built in 1902, and why do you think they needed a boathouse?
On the opposite side of the river.
Get to the lighthouse.
To get to the lighthouse. So it's about, so from the boathouse, it's about 1,800 feet out to the end of the pier, which you could walk, except it's on the other side. So they built a boathouse so we could put a little boat in there to literally row to the other side of the river to get to the lighthouse. Anyway, this is a really kind of a neat little drawing. The other thing that's really neat about this is that when they built the new keeper's house, keeper's dwelling they called it, so this plot of land is 50 feet by 200, this piece of property, and they actually, Chuck, I got some documentation that shows they had a little trouble figuring out the actual boundaries because for some reason they couldn't find the plat in the courthouse or something. But when they figured out where the property lines were, they put 4 piers. They put a square pier by 6 inches square and buried them in the corners. And the initials on those say USLHE for a U.S. Lighthouse Establishment. So it's kind of cool. So 2 of those have been pulled up and saved, and I'm hoping we can put one of those out on the lighthouse.
The museum has it.
That's why I've been so, that's why I've been so nice to Peggy. Okay, so in 1906, one of the things that the engineer visited, he recommended that the lighthouse be put on piers instead of sitting in a wood pile. So here is the estimate for the building of the concrete piers. And if you walk out to the end of you can't really get out to the end of the west pier easily, but if you walk out to the end of the east pier, or you take a boat up and down the river, and you look over to the end of the west pier where the lighthouse was, you'll see that those piers are still there. And people ask us, why can't you just take those piers and move them? And you can't because they're actually cemented down into the... They built this crib, and then they poured cement in there right down into the crib. So we really couldn't move those. Okay, so this is the lighthouse when it's still sitting on a pile foundation. There's only a couple of 2 or 3 photographs that exist of it sitting on the pile. Can anybody tell me what that little building is behind the lighthouse?
Oil shed.
It's an oil shed. It's an iron oil shed. So why did they need an oil shed? To store oil. You don't want to store oil in the lighthouse because, especially a wooden lighthouse, because obviously you have a higher risk of fire. So they built the oil house in 1905, and they put the lighthouse up on piers in 1906. So we know this photograph was taken in either 1905 or 1906. The other thing that's interesting about this photograph is If you look at the windows, you can't see the light. That's because there's curtains hanging in those windows. The lighthouse establishment, the lighthouse board, in their wisdom, realized that if you expose the Fresnel lens to constant sunlight, you will degrade. So one of the things they put in their regulations was that you have to have curtains in the lighthouse windows and close those curtains during the day when the light is not in use so that sunlight will not hit the lens. Okay, so that's what the book, yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? And I apologize if I'm jumping ahead of your presentation. But how far was that lighthouse above the water level in that last photo?
Okay, so, good, that's a good question to start with. Okay, so we have reports, and I'm going to just give you a guess because it's off the top of my head, but so the focal plane, which is basically in the middle of those windows, would be where the focal plane, you want the focal plane to be. So the light is installed on a pedestal, and where that light is the focal plane. So the literature that we have says that the focal plane was 25 point something feet above the water, above the mean high water level.
So but the bottom of the lighthouse though, what's at the rocks? It's basically resting on the rocks or piling underneath that?
In this photograph, it's sitting on a pile, yes.
So 5 to 8 feet above the water? My question is, how do they deal with ice? Why didn't ice wipe this thing out? I mean, if you look at the ice that was on the end of the pier last year, I think it would have taken something like this out.
And I got a photograph I'll show you later that shows ice pile really high next to the lighthouse. That's a good question, and I think one of the reasons they put it on piers was because of the risk of damage from ice. If there was damage caused by ice, we don't have yet any documentation of that. Now, we know that repairs were made over time, at different times. When we did the restoration, we found evidence that at various times people wrote their initials on it. In the 1930s, there were some repairs done. There is evidence that there was some fire damage up on top at some point, like somebody had dropped some oil and it caught on fire or something. But we don't have any direct documentation that there was damage caused by ice. But you're absolutely right, that would be a fear, because ice would definitely pile up. But I'm sure that one of the reasons they would have put it up on piers would be to get it higher up. Not only so it could be seen farther, but to protect it from ice. So, good question. So here's the boathouse. One of the things that we've gotten from the National Archives is we've got now a full set of plans for the boathouse. So should we ever want to build a replica of it, we could easily build one. It was, the dimensions were 12 by 18, the internal dimensions. So it was probably a small skiff that they had in there. And here's another picture of the boathouse. You can see behind the fishermen. So if you can picture where it was right there in that little corner at the south end of the East Pier. Okay, so another picture of the lighthouse with the oil house. The oil house was approximately 60 feet or so south of the lighthouse. I love these old photographs. The Alma was a fishing boat that was very well known. There's a lot of pictures of it in different scenes, but that's a nice picture of the lighthouse.
It also made its way down to Lakeside.
Oh, the Alma. Another really cool photograph. Again, you see the lighthouse and the oil house. If you want to know exactly what that lighthouse, that oil house looked like up close, if you get to South Bass Island and you go to the lighthouse there, there's an oil house there that's painted yellow. It's exactly one like this one. Exactly.
I understand this one was red.
Yeah, it was painted red. Okay, so one of the photos you gave me, Chuck, I blew up. And in later photos, there's a little sign that's here. You can't really see it there, but it says U.S. Coast Guard on it. So we know from that this photograph, and you can see something obviously in the Coast Guard uniform up on the tower. So you had the lighthouse establishment in various forms over the years. So the Coast Guard took over all lighthouses in 1936, I believe. And so this lighthouse came under the custody of the Coast Guard then at that point. And so I would date this after that. Because I believe these are Coast Guard personnel, and there is that Coast Guard sign on it. And by the way, you can look through the door and see the Fresnel lens in there. Now, in photographs where the oil house is gone, that tells you that it's after 1926 or 27. So what happened was, as they did with all lighthouses, they discontinued using oil and switched to electricity. And this lighthouse was automated to electricity in 1926. So they ran a cable out. It ran through where the yacht club is now on a pole down into the side of the pier and ran along and out to the lighthouse. And I'm not sure if I have a photo where it shows the cable. So at that point, they didn't need as of 1926, they didn't need a full-time keeper anymore, but they hired somebody at a lesser salary. They still needed somebody to go out there, keep everything clean, clean the lens, and do all that kind of stuff, but they just didn't need a full-time keeper. So they didn't need a boathouse anymore. So they took the boathouse out of the water at that point, or sometime soon after 1926 or 27, and they removed the oil house. And we don't know where the oil house went. Some people were confused and thought the boathouse was the oil house, or they thought the oil house was still in the park somewhere, but it's not. We don't know what happened to it. Okay, here's this photograph. You can see the conduit for the electricity on the side of the lighthouse very clearly. This is one of my favorite photos.
What year would that be?
Oh,
I don't know, Chuck, 30s?
30s or 40s. There's not enough detail in it to determine.
You see how people are dressed. It's clearly not 20s anymore. Maybe more likely 40s,
I would lean that way.
just based on what people are wearing. Again, you can see the Fresnel lens and the...
You can also see some of the remaining piers or pilings right by the piers there.
Now, one of the things interesting about this picture also is there's no curtains in the windows. Because what happened was, when the Coast Guard took over, somewhere along the line, they lost the institutional knowledge, or it was not passed along, that these lenses could degrade from exposure to sunlight. And so they didn't put curtains up anymore. And the Coast Guard started to realize over a period of time, uh-oh, our lenses are degrading. So by that time they were starting to pull Fresnel lenses out of lighthouses. They were putting different kinds of lights in and so forth. But where they were once very sort of lackadaisical about it, the Coast Guard is now very strict about very strict about maintaining these lenses. So while they used to be in all the lighthouses, they won't let a lens go back in a lighthouse because they're not temperature controlled and, you know, and all this kind of stuff. So I find that a little bit ironic. So here's your picture with the ice on the pier, showing how high it can get. This is a neat picture, color picture. Latter days. So I did a lot of newspaper searching, and you can find a lot of references to, it was routine in November, typically in November or maybe December, there'd be a notice in the paper saying, the keeper has turned off the light. And then in the spring, in March, typically, keepers turn on the light. This was not something he did on a whim. Somebody from the district would decide when officially travel on the Great Lakes would cease, commercial traffic, and that would be the date that all the lighthouses would turn off their lights. So Clarence Rip Perry, if anybody remembers that name, was hired, I believe, about 1930, and that's the best evidence right now, about 1930, and until about 1950, or about 20 years, he was the custodian. Now, I have documentation that shows that when they downgraded the position from lighthouse keeper, they called it a lamp lighter. And here they call him a custodian. So I don't know if at some point, again, there's no documentation. I don't know if at some point they stopped calling it that. Perhaps when the Coast Guard took over, they didn't use that title anymore. But Clarence Perry was paid a salary to maintain that light. And technically, he was not a lighthouse keeper, but for all intents and purposes, he was. Because somebody had to clean the lens and do all that stuff. Okay, so 1952, best information, November 1952. Dave Jeremy, the late Dave Jeremy, was hired to remove the light from the pier. I've heard that that he paid $1 for it. I don't know if that's true. Have you heard that, Chuck?
I think so.
Actually, the contract gave him money for 5 gallons of coal oil to burn it.
This is Claire.
This is Claire Jeremy.
Okay, that's, do we have any documentation of that, Clarence?
Just coal and
Okay.
When I was sticking my feet in there,
Must have been the sun up.
yeah, he's always been like, oh, that's the one we want.
So the government wanted it gotten rid of, and they really didn't care if he burned it or what he did with it. So,
No, I just wanted to go on.
so had he decided to do that, we wouldn't have a lighthouse now.
That's right.
So Dave Jeremy saved the lighthouse in 1952. And I think we all know the story where it goes then. He put it in his marina. It sat in the, on the river beginning in 1950, end of 1952 for the next 60 years. Jumping back to the boathouse real quick, it was taken from, so it was originally about here. It was moved to here for just a couple of years, and the reason they moved it is apparently because of work they did here. It might actually live closer here, but they moved it over here, and then as I said, when the lighthouse, once the lighthouse was gone, they didn't need the boathouse. So somebody pulled the boathouse off the pier, put it in the park, got moved to different locations, was not maintained. I guess it was a clubhouse for baseball equipment.
Yeah, they used to store the baseball.
Storage.
No, that's what. I remember that.
I bet you there was any number of people who looked at that and said, what the heck is, never thinking it was ever a boathouse.
This really takes all over.
Okay, so, was it 2010? 2010. Peggy knows, well remembers that day.
I think I took that
She
picture.
shot that photo.
I crawled up and practically got it downstairs.
Anyway, I will say, at that point in time, it was in a very sad state of repair. But nonetheless, we lost the boathouse. So, Port Clinton Lighthouse Conservancy comes along. I'm not going to go into the whole history of the Conservancy, but thanks to Darrell Brandt, who's here today, he got together with former Mayor Tester. They came up with a plan to give it to the city. Administration changed, and it, at that point became somewhat of an issue moving it. But in any event, the restoration began, and that started off with basically an assessment of the condition, and the condition was not very good. It was in pretty bad, rough shape. And the closer you got to it, the worse it looked. And Alex, you can attest, of course, John Smothers. John Smothers has basically headed up the restoration team, and he's just done, I think, a brilliant job. As with everybody on the board, his dedication is unbelievable to me, and he's done a great job. He and Bill Moon, his alter ego, have basically sort of commandeered the, or taken charge of the restoration. But it was in bad shape. Part of what happened is, when Dave Jeremy said it on the marina, he put it up on blocks, but the water levels came up, earth gathered around it and stuff, and anytime you contact wood with the ground, you're going to have a bad result. So the lower half of the lighthouse was really beyond repair. So had to figure out at that point in time, you know, what to do. And first of all, it had to be moved someplace, indoors someplace, so the restoration could begin. So the first challenge was figuring out, I really love this. We found all kinds of stuff. Lifted off the cupola. So that was taken indoors and worked on. So the copper that you see here, the copper that was both on the roof of the cupola and also on the roof of the tower itself, and on top of the window and door, that had to be replaced. It was just in too poor condition to keep. So that's been replaced. And Tammy Almendinger, bless her heart, has made some wonderful frames and ornaments and things out of the copper, and has donated the proceeds from doing that to our effort. So, as I said, the lower part was gone. Had to figure out, first of all, how to pick the thing up without it just falling apart. And our engineer, Bill Moon, came up with sort of a brilliant answer on how to stabilize it enough to pick it up. And that was successfully done. And jumping forward, we got the city to see things our way in terms of where to put it. And this year we began Putting in the foundation, here's the foundation's getting poured. Here's the piers up. And this is basically where we're at right now. So,
Rich, are those piers the same height as the originals?
yeah,
I wondered.
And what is that thing sticking up on the left? Every time I drive past there, I wonder.
that's conduit for the wiring.
Oh, thank you.
You notice they put a date in the right-hand here too?
1896. So, the church next to Bill Moo's house was built in 1896. And he stenciled, he did a rubbing of the 1896 to match, so we matched the font to the church date. So it says 1896. Where the cones are in front, that's where the steps are going to go, the new steps. And so here's a little bit of timeline of where we're going to be at. We're having a replica fifth order lens built. They're so perfect, they're indistinguishable from the originals. They're fully functioning. They're just as good as the original. Because it's acrylic instead of glass, they're considerably lighter.
And the Coast Guard actually let you put the light in it?
Yes, now here's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to get permission from the Coast Guard. It's not going to be an aid to navigation, because you don't want ships running under the beach, just off the lighthouse.
Shipwreckers logs, too.
So, but there is a, you can apply to the Coast Guard to get permission to put a light in, and they just tell people there's a light here. You know, I mean, if you go out into the lake and you look toward the shore, there's all kinds of lights everywhere. So it's okay to have a light there. You just need to tell the Coast Guard so they can tell people that's not an aid to navigation. It's just a light. Don't worry about it. So that's the plan.
How are they gonna get it to the island? How are they gonna move the lighthouse?
Wow, that's the fun part.
I heard you're gonna float it down the river.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah. So it's going to be lifted up and placed onto a barge at Brent's Marina, taken out into the river, floated down the river. This all has to be coordinated with the Coast Guard and the city and everybody, and the Jet Express, the guy that lifts up the bridge. We're going to float it down the river. We're going to go somewhere along where the East Pier is, lift it back off and onto like a lowboy, and then take it to the site, lift it up again, and put it onto the piers.
Do you have an exact date you're gonna do that?
We don't yet. We're waiting for our crane operator to tell us when.
Will that be in the paper?
Yes.
I want to see it.
It's going to be heavily advertised. We'd like to get the whole town out to watch this thing move, and maybe national media. So, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that's all I have for you. Now, I want to tell you that, anybody have any questions about the timeline, actually? Port Clinton's going to have a
I
lighthouse.
have something about future timelines, which probably right now you don't want to know about. If you build a boathouse replica, where would you put it?
We've talked about some ideas, but I don't really want to talk about anything specific until we're a little farther along. But we would love to build a replica of the boathouse.
That would be like the Marblehead redoing the life-saving station.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, that would be neat.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so the light station was the lighthouse, the oil house, the boathouse, and the dwelling house. We only have one of those left. And so, you know, we'd like to We had hoped that we could have saved the keeper's dwelling. Had it not been damaged by fire, that might have been a little more realistic. At the time we were so involved in this, you know, it would have been spreading us too thin to try to lobby for that. But that would have been a good place for, a perfect place for us to have, you know, a place to display all the memorabilia and artifacts and, you know, and sell t-shirts and stuff. But unfortunately, you know, so we're going to need a place to do that. Yes, Connie?
Rich, if anyone is interested in seeing some of Tammy Allmendiger's artifacts, there are some at Mary's Blossom Shop, which has some earrings. I have my earrings on today. And also the Unique Antique Shop has the fish and the picture frames and things.
Where's the Unique Antique Shop?
Next to Green Drum.
Okay, okay. Yeah, Tammy has made some wonderful things with that original copper. And as I said, all proceeds go to the Conservancy to maintain the lighthouse. We're going to be relying on membership. So we have a, I'm sorry I don't have the link on here, but www.portclintonlighthouse.org. And we're on Facebook. For day-to-day updates, the best place to go is our Facebook page, if you're on Facebook. But you can go to our website and be looking for ways that you can become a member. And that's going to be a sort of a primary funding source for us is our membership. And we'll likely have a newsletter, and your membership, you'll be able to, you know, get free tours anytime you want. And stuff like that. So we have a donation chart back here. Any questions on the history at all?
I was wondering if along the railroad tracks, you see those steel buildings or iron buildings along the railroad tracks? Have you ever noticed that?
I'm not familiar with those. Do they look similar to
They
what?
look very similar, yeah. Yeah, there's one there by, what's the street that hospital's on? Fulton. On the railroad track, if you're going down Fulton Street, if you look up and to the right, if you're going north, you can see it right up there. By the railroad.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. The oil houses would have been fabricated at the depots. Any other questions? I just think Port Clinton has such a fascinating maritime history, and I think this is part of what this lighthouse is doing is helping us sort of revive that sense that we're on the lake, and you know, we did have a lighthouse, and we had a lighthouse keeper, and you know, those guys you know, earn their money. They have to be out there every day, lighting the lamp, and cleaning the lamp, and doing all this stuff, and we will have we will have a tours that will, and we will be explaining what the lighthouse keeper did and how he did it, and all that was involved in that.
Do you have a list of all of those?
We do, and I'm sorry I didn't put those in this presentation, but we do know who they are. I think we know who most of them were. And I'm still researching the history of these folks, and so, we had something in the newspaper recently looking for information on anybody who was a keeper.
I'm just curious, is there something through this whole process that's kind of stumped the group in terms of trying to find something or some information, or, you know, something maybe you're still looking on that?
Well,
is there something that?
On the list of things that I'd like to answers to, number one on my list would be what happened to our fifth order Fresnel ends. We asked the Coast Guard, they don't know. It probably got pulled out and put in some other lighthouse, but I've been told by more than one person that knows lighthouse history that when the Coast Guard was pulling these lenses out of some of these lighthouses, they were literally throwing them in the water.
Yeah, they're destroying them, right? And my grandfather told
Yeah.
me they destroyed the lens from this lighthouse.
Did he see them do that?
I think he did, yeah.
Okay, well, that makes me nervous.
You think it's in the water, you think that they would do that at the end of the pier?
It might be interesting for a diver to go down.
That's what I'm just, you do some kind of sonar.
Carried it very far. 'cause it's
Look for
right there.
pieces of glass.
Right. It might have stayed there.
Yes, Alex?
You know, it might be interesting for people to know that one of the reasons that the Fresnel lens was not adopted, in addition to the intransigence of the head of the lighthouse at the time, was that it was so much more expensive at the time. And the Fresnel lens that the lighthouse is going to be putting, the fifth order, could be putting in the replica from a very well-established company, cost $35,000. And that's a replica today, and even at the time, in the late 1800s, it worked out to be an enormous amount of money, which is one of the reluctances, even though the luminosity of the Fresnel lens was so much superior to anything else that had ever been established. But that had something to do also with the delay, that he was a cheapskate.
Government.
Well, they were very expensive. They imported these things from France, so.
And his buddy also had the patent on the lenses that were primarily used in the United States. So that might have also compounded the slow adoption.
It was his buddy.
Yeah, his friend developed another type of lamp.
But it's a fascinating history. We're going to be telling that history. We will be publishing a book that also can be purchased, you know, but that's, you know, one of the things we don't have is, that other lighthouses have, is we don't have a place that you can just go to and where we have all this stuff, you know. So that's kind of a problem for us, you know, anybody that's renting cheap.
Sure would seem a replica of that boathouse would serve a good purpose for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Have you got estimates of that? What it would take?
We haven't gone to that point yet, but I mean, our people could build it, for sure.
Because you had plans.
We have the full set of plans.
Actually, Rich won't mention this, but we've talked about it. If people just refer to the area now as Lighthouse Park, it's easier to receive forgiveness than permission. So we're not, but if everybody starts referring to Lighthouse Park, people will think Lighthouse Park when they think of that. It doesn't require we don't want to ask anybody to change any names. But hopefully that boathouse will be in Lighthouse Park one day.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Alex.
What do you see for the preservation of this 50, 100 years down the road?
Well, you know, we worry about that all the time because our group, we have a very dedicated group, but we worry where it's going to be in 20, 30, 40 years and further on. If it's maintained, it shouldn't take that much to maintain it if you do the regular maintenance. And we're going to have a maintenance manual. We're going to have everything in place to keep it preserved. But it's up to the people that actually hear them to do that.
Right.
And if they don't do that, then it's not going to last. But we're hoping, I'm confident, that this community will embrace this lighthouse to the point where they're not going to let it, you know, deteriorate. It will be.
Don't you already have some charter members? You have some charter members?
Yes. If you happen to have $1,000 lying around, you can get a charter membership. Well, yes, we have several charter memberships. They're listed on our webpage. Any way that you can support us. We're going to be asking for recruiting docents. So if you have enough time and the inclination to want to be a docent at the Lighthouse, I'm going to be putting together a docent program and recruiting docents. But if you think you might be interested, you know, give me your name now and I'll keep you on the list. But we're gonna be doing that because we wanna be, you know, by next year, we wanna have a regular tour schedule, so we're gonna need the volunteers. So, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, John.